Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
You know, it's a delight to talk shop with a fellow appreciator of organization of all kinds, particularly how they become more human in their development over the time that they are in existence. And that would be Cecile Betit, with whom I did talk shop in this conversation. But fortunately for you, she did a lot more talking than I did about one of her most profound interests as an OD practitioner, which is employee ownership, and what difference that makes in regard to the inner development of a company to match the outer development that tends to be commonly observed. The inner development takes a keener eye and an understanding of human behavior in organizations that Cecile certainly has. And you'll hear her talk about her subject, her primary subject of the day, a company called Karas, K-A-R-A-S, who makes reels, Karas reels. They make the kinds of reels that cables get wound around. That's not a very complex product, and yet it certainly is, and most importantly, it's owned by its employees, and they make almost all the important decisions about how to get those reels ordered, made, delivered, and maintained all over the Western Hemisphere. So here is the storyteller, the person who has the eye on inner development, Cecile Betit. Folks, recently I attended a very interesting inaugural event of something called the Open Source Open Source Organization Development. And the gentleman who I have had a podcast episode with, Bill Blendell, had convened a wonderful, eclectic group of people who are concerned about the quality of life in an organization, and are there better ways that we can invent or improve that will make living in an organization, making a living and living in an organization much more attractive. And one of the folks that I met was Cecile Betit, Cecile Betit. And as much as I grew up in a state of Maine where a lot of Canadian French folks have moved, I still have to learn how to speak respectfully of a French last name, Betit. It's a beautiful name, really, much prettier than Betit, which I'm sure you've gotten, Cecile. So welcome. And do you recall that event too, or maybe I got to re-record my introduction? Do you recall the event with Bill Blendell?
Yes, I do. And at the end, there was an interesting interchange between theory and practice.
Yeah.
And that brought us to the inner development goals, and then our conversation today.
Yeah, I love that notion of the inner development goals. And I would like you to talk about the very interesting work you're doing, researching essentially the life of an employee-owned company in real time. But what in a nutshell were the inner development goals that you referred to when we had that conversation?
They grow. The group that started them grew out of the Sustainable Goals from the UN. And I think as we have begun to realize, and everywhere, the outer development requires an inner capacity. And so these folks began to develop these 5 goals across the spectrum, and then there are inner goals within those as well. And they've been meeting and discussing, and yesterday ended a competitive selection process from certain applicants across countries that they wanted more represented
Mm-hmm.
within the spectrum of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that group is going to hopefully broaden us across cultures and across all kinds of thoughts regarding inner development, as well as bring more access to inner development, the goals in terms of the sustainability goals of the UN.
Right. So were there, I think, 14 or 17 of those at one point?
Yes.
The UN Global Sustainability Goals. And so if you look at them as a circle within a circle within a circle within a circle, now reaches the point of the immediate experience of people. But in my mind, that's a good thing because, as you just said, it connects us to these abstractions, however we're living our lives organizationally. Is there a quick example that comes to your mind of an emerging inner goal that, now that you've expanded the conversation, is going to be easy to understand by folks like me?
Well, one of them involves being. Another, involves relationship. And so as you read them, they're not a foreign language.
Yeah.
The thing that I think that for those of us in organizational development that makes them particularly important now is that we have talked about development, but we've not used the modalities like Kagan or the Inner Development Group in a way that is, in a sense, practice.
Mm-hmm.
So as you look at the inner development goals of being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting, it's not that we don't have a notion of them. And it's not that consultants in the field don't have a relationship with these goals as they're promoting development within a corporation. And way back when you and I were just studying,
Mm-hmm.
I remember an old timer at that time, whose name I can't remember at the moment, spoke of the fact that organizations can only move forward with those who can and those who will.
I like that. Yeah, I do.
And I think that's the point of the practice.
Yep. Those who can and will.
Yes. And how do we promote capacity within those kinds of dynamics that can encourage the kind of growth that we're needing in our time?
Yeah.
My own view on that is that one of the things that employee ownership does as an advantage is that there's, in a sense, no reason to hold anyone back. Whether it's by pay, whether it's by expertise, why it's by growth. It's by definition, in a sense, going back to Adam Smith and his theory of moral development and wealth of nations, which was a very spiritually based thought of doing well and doing good, all in the same package.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That, in a sense, employee ownership is a pure sense of that.
Yeah.
Encouraging people to be all they can be, and then adding the dynamic for the good of the whole.
And then the whole beyond the whole, in the sense that employee-owned companies, from my experience, tend to be very aware of the social conditions, particularly in their immediate community, because the owners live there. They don't live in all of them, up in the fancy suburbs. So they're there, they're close to their families and friends and all kinds of things going on in their churches. And so that social consciousness is part of the will, isn't it? So the can is having no artificial limits on their ability to learn and grow on the job. And the will has to do with their desire to grow and make a difference or to matter. These are things that we've talked about forever. And I love the sound of it.
And as you look at that idea of the will and can, it's also that most of us don't see possibilities until we're in the fray.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a group years ago at IBM that were the thinkers. And what they would often do, from the stories that I've heard, not having been one of them, is that they would walk into town. They would walk in nature. They would get involved in a conversation with a teenager, but they would get themselves out of their own box.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'd race whatever they were working on to this odd person, like a plumber. And that they didn't know that field at all or whatever. And they would just throw out this question. And often what would come back would have a base of practicality that would be a ground. And if we look at the idea that a lot of what we know in terms of scientific endeavors occurred in a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that as we look at employee ownership, in a sense, if we'd also look at like the Fearon model, there's a whole way of being and including as a person that you don't have when you're a number and you're just a wage. And management has accountability to the owners.
Yeah. Mutual accountability, if you will,
Exactly.
and employee owned. Yeah. And I can understand from a historical and legal standpoint why you still need to be called employee in tax purposes and everything else. But it's almost a paradox. I'm an owner, but I'm an employee. And this takes us to that very classic employer status, which is separate in structural ways and so forth and so on. And I don't know, over the time you've been studying this, Cecile, how do you wrestle with or do you even wrestle with the employer versus employee paradigm?
My study was done with Karis Reels. And one of the things that Bill Karis did 10 years before he sold the company to his employees was to begin to write a long-term plan, which was basically both value-based and practical.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, one of the elements that occurred to him was that the insight came to him of a way of making a statement that later became the mission statement and also the company purpose, which is to improve the lives of our growing corporate community. And growth could be interpreted in many ways in his head on that, but also community.
Like that.
Which links the inside and the outside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, that became a little bit like the golden rule. That was something that even when people didn't understand what employee ownership was, they understood that piece. And they each had their own subjective view of what improvement meant for them. For example, one of the elements, and the company was doing very well particularly at the start of the transition. Somebody mentioned one day at a meeting, the cars in the parking lot are different. And somebody said, "What do you mean?" "Well, we've got more new trucks." Okay, and that was a sign of a growing prosperity.
Yeah.
They wanted to be able to sell the company at 10% a year, but that got into some IRS dilemmas. And see, Bill was, I shouldn't say, it wasn't the selling piece that was at issue. Bill gave 50% of the company, and he wanted to do that first.
Mm-hmm.
And at 10% a year, that put people into some tax problems with their 401ks and all that. And so they needed to pull back from that amount. And so they did, and they changed percentages. And then with the dot-com bust, they had to slow down in terms of the value of the company and all that kind of dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole way of working this through, and one of the goals that Bill had at the start, one of the commitments that he made was that he would not only sell the company to the employees, having given he called it selling it at 50% of market value. There was this idea that he wanted to bring employees into the business.
Yeah.
That was why he had bought the company from his dad.
Yeah.
And so his commitment was to teach employees the business. And my observations coming back to the inner development goals that are I'm working on a little bit differently than I did years ago. One of the elements that I'm recognizing is that relationship of awareness and what we see in a situation and how we grow with it. And one of the elements that was very difficult for people to understand, I felt at the beginning, was what it really meant to be an owner.
Yeah. And it's a foreign idea unless you are literally, and I think Vermont was where all of this started. The sense of being an owner when you're a farmer, yeah, I am. I know that. But to step out into, in quotes, someone else's employee, it locks a mindset. And it does put you in a peripheral position in the business, which is kind of odd, isn't it? They do the business, but they aren't savvy and feeling the business as you expect Bill, the owner, would feel. So he wants to transfer that feeling and share it with a lot of folks, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the elements that I feel that I was very pleased to watch, and even more pleased as I've gone recently through some notes, Chris Mackin of Ownership Associates, who was a consultant, now a teacher, a professor at Rutgers, developed a decision-making model using what many of us in organizational behavior thought of as the 34 decisions for every business had to make.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me, whether you were 5 people or 100 people. I mean, these decisions in some fashion would need to be made. And one of the very important elements of it was that in the system, every employee, every worker could alert that a decision needed to be made. And then the process led to a single decision maker,
Mm-hmm.
even as a role. I sat through a lot of groups working their own, each division, each separate site had part of the system that was for them, the site goals and all that. Those decisions would be made locally.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were the decisions that would need to be made corporately,
Mm-hmm.
which were made by a corporate steering committee.
Mm-hmm.
And I should probably mention that group before I go any further. Bill's original vision was not just for employee ownership, it was for employee governance.
Ah, yeah.
And being a Vermonter, one person, one vote, was a very critical element. And he was very comfortable with town meeting, where everybody came together.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of confrontation, sometimes lovely and sometimes not.
Sure. I
You're
never
from
saw
Maine,
a
you
town
remember?
meeting that went smoothly in my experience of them in small town life, but I loved it. I loved the trust that went with listening to people who sometimes irritate the hell out of you, but you still listen. So Bill brought that to the ethos of the company.
Exactly. And the company had had an experience of the site managers meeting with corporate executives in Rutland. And of course, at that time, the company was headquartered in Rutland, Vermont, but it had a branch in Connecticut. It had a branch in North Carolina, and it had a branch in what they called Michiana, which was the Michigan-Indiana border, and California. Some of these were, assembly sites. Some of them were manufacturing as well. And so they would all come together and they would discuss the company. To do the long-term plan implementation, he had gathered a group with the ESOP lawyer and others that needed to be involved to form the ESOP with employees. And part of the criteria was he wanted employees that were very verbal, not necessarily agreeers. And he wanted those people represented. And they came forward as the long-term plan steering committee. And then the implementation, they developed a strategy and structure for the implementation of the allocation for the stock that was not hierarchically based.
Mm.
The salary in 1995 that was settled on was $30,000. That was a small percentage. The larger percentage was longevity. And that went forward. And the employees, in a sense, voted on that. They had a few allocations, formulas that they voted on.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that for the longevity was the one that was selected. And people really liked that model of having corporate site managers with the employees in a group wrestling this stuff out. The lawyer at one point, between Bill's wanting to do the 50% discount and this particular structure, was a little bit unusual because it was very democratic.
Mm.
And that's how the system started. So as you moved along in the decision-making structure, there was this whole desire to bring this, as we know in OD, this has been one of our tenets going back to the beginning, is that we want decisions made at the lowest level possible.
Yes.
And this was the Karas goal as well. And part of the dilemma, part of the dilemma was the idea of defining a decision, those 34, in the context that they were. Part of what my own thinking changed at was watching the workers change as they worked with these ideas. Because they had to grapple. There was nobody there to say, this is what you ought to do. And so, and the facilitators that were working on this would be asking questions like, have you ever been involved in purchasing equipment? What was the dilemma? What was the thing? And so the people that were in the room would talk about their own machine breaking down and what happened about getting it repaired and all of that. And so as you watch them, you begin to see possibilities emerge in the room.
Wow, that must have been wonderful.
It was. And also because all I was doing was writing.
And watching and witnessing.
Yes, exactly. But I had no, in a sense, facilitation responsibility.
Right.
Or anything like that. I was there really just watching the north wind come through. And but I was aware, pardon me, that the importance of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in so much of what we're doing now, that element is being lost. I think that is when people say that book learning is not enough, I think it's that piece.
Yeah. So the experience aspect that you witnessed in action, essentially, as people were wrestling with whether it was a machine repair issue or whatever the issue may be, you saw people spontaneously advancing thoughts, mulling them over, all of that. And I'm guessing that there was no one in those meetings, hopefully, who thought, well, I don't want to say anything. I'm just the guy, hauling out the trash at the end of the day. Or I'm only the second person in the line to handle that particular process. So that subordination, which I've always railed against anyway, being you and I being Northern New Englanders, is real, and why it maybe seem to be missing today in many workplaces is that there's this idea now that with digital fact and digitized facts and all these kind of abstractions of the business, decision makers at that level can see enough and execute and issue orders, which then therefore must be executed. It's a scary trend. If I had my way, and would you agree, I would take those digital streams and I would add them to the toolkit on the floor so that people could see digitally, see the facts of the work. And that probably emerged, Cecile, didn't, as you were studying this company?
Yes. Like for every job, there was, particularly in manufacturing, there were very straightforward things, primarily for safety.
Sure.
How to do the job. But there were things like that. Also in terms of training. Training became a much more important element throughout the study. And the idea, one of the elements at the corporate steering committee meeting, I always, when I took notes, put people's names, because I could not tell from the notes the difference between a corporate manager and a worker often.
Wow.
Okay?
Wow.
And there was one occasion, there was a consultant that was working on the consensus model that the corporate steering committee used. Okay. And this was a part of the meeting that he was not on. So he and I were sitting together at a little table. I usually sat at a little table off to the side, taking notes. And so all of a sudden, this man came in late for the meeting. And anyway, sat down with the stuff and then stood up. And then basically, with a little line of profanity, looked at the management and said, "What's going on?" And so anyway, Bill Karras responded and said, "Wow, I know you're upset, but I don't know what you're upset about. But we all want to know now." And Bill sat down.
Wow. What patience with the process.
Well, anyway, this man said he had just come back from the shop and there was a problem. And somebody had tried to resolve it, but because everybody was in that room, they couldn't resolve it. But anyway, to make a long story short, the important element there for everybody that was there, and this was discussed later, particularly because the consultant I was next to said, I was at a meeting yesterday of a major corporation in Chicago. If this had happened there, that man would have been ushered out.
It's kind of security. Yeah.
But it was, of course, the fact that this person was very known, had been known, and was also very known as conscientious and also not dramatic. And somebody said next to me later at lunch, I heard more out of him today than I ever heard. Oh, years we worked together.
So that incident really moved him and brought him to a point where he felt responsible for the company's learning this, not just, complaining to the next guy or out on the parking lot, but actually. And
he was very much the owner.
Yes.
And that was one of the things that a couple of the managers brought out.
That's a great moment, Cecile.
Yes. And also for people in the room, that this man was so respected with his observation. And the vice president, after they had done a little bit of this, the vice president and the local site manager left with him to make sure they could get this resolved very quickly, because they both knew that it could be resolved, but they thought if they both went, each of them could make one of the calls, and they would be back to the meeting factor. And that was fine. But are there other ways that this could have been handled? Probably. But it was one of those things that everybody used as a teaching moment and brought it forward. And it was perfect in a sense for the decision-making model that was unfolding, because everyone could be an alerter. And this man was an alerter.
Yep.
And that was in front of 50 people that were attending that meeting. And I should say that the employees, the workers that were at the steering committee, every site could elect one representative for 50 employees. Or if the site was too small, they got one anyway.
Yeah.
So some site at one point there was a very large site, and they had several representatives, and at that time the steering committee was quite large. But basically, as you look at, let's say, administrator management types with one board representative, the steering committee is pretty close to half and half, or it was the last time that I sat at meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of thing that I think is just a very wonderful way that the Keras companies brought forward, in a sense, what people are talking about in engagement. Bill felt that real ownership was a whole different tool than psychological ownership. And his big thing when he was talking to the employees, particularly at the beginning, was that the important thing was not that they were going to be making better wages, which of course they wanted them to do. It's that they were building wealth. And that has been very, very true. I mean, some of the employees have left. Now it's over 20 years. This started in 1995. And so, they've got longevity. And so they're leaving with, hundreds of thousands of dollars of retirement money.
Yep. And those are their stocks. So
exactly.
So they certainly would, knowing that and seeing the example, the newer employees would say, "Hey, I want to be able to retire with this stock. So I'm going to be very interested in how the company's doing profitably and expense management and all that, because that keeps the worth of the stock at the level that will get us where we want to be." So it's much different than the abstraction of stocks that most people working in companies that are supported through stocks, that they may see the numbers up on on a
Yes.
banner or something, but it doesn't have that same relevance.
Right. And they get their evaluation statement every year.
Yeah. So right there it is, right there. Yeah.
Right. And Keras has been more profitable as an employee-owned company than it ever was previously.
Yeah. That's the proof of the pudding.
Exactly. And people are making better wages, and they're involved in the decision making. And it's not a perfect world, because there's always new problems. There's always new employees. There's always, as we all know, the human condition does not leave, everything behind when you become an owner. But the whole idea of being a part of something,
Yeah. Belonging.
the collaboration, having everybody represented in a room together when major decisions are made, open book management. I mean, everybody knows, the financials. And at Keras, it's the idea of the governance. There are two workers on the corporate board of trustees. I should say corporate board of directors.
Board of directors,
Yeah. The whole way of, and on the ESOP trustees, there are two managers and three employees. And they spend a great deal of time working to make sure that they understand their fiduciary responsibilities. They went through a whole system development for their ESOP trustees.
Mm.
And as they've done for their corporate board of directors people. And so as you look again at the idea of that organizations move with those who can and those who will, building the capacity is critical.
Yeah. And technology, yes, technology for sure, but it's the human capacity that you're focusing on, I think, Cecile,
Yeah.
in relation to the changes in technology that are inevitable. Now, this company, as I recall, looking a little bit at their webpage, makes reels, essentially things that cable and other wires are wrapped around.
Right.
Either made of wood or probably originally wood, but other materials. And people say, well, why all of this just to make a reel? But it's not just to, is it? It's there's a lot of work and talent needed to make those reels, get them sold, obviously, produced, shipped, distributed, shipped, all of that. So it's a pretty complex business.
It really is. And even though parts of it, as you indicated, are very simple,
Mm-hmm.
And as you look at in today's world, they've had to get much more sophisticated about safety.
Yes.
And all of that. And they've now expanded, they expanded into Mexico, even before they were 100% employee owned. But they're also now in Canada, and are doing very, very important things. In Mexico, they developed a way of a parallel way to create employee ownership for their employees there.
Mm-hmm.
And the Canadian company will be doing something like that in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The experience will be international at that point.
Oh, yeah.
And it already is partly, but it will be even more so.
There's this a nostrum, really, that the bigger you become, the more bureaucratic you must become, the further away from the point of work, the in quotes, corporation grows. And I don't hear this at all in this particular example you've been studying, Cecile. Somehow or another, they're figuring out how to get big as well as maintain the close interaction necessary to have an employee ownership.
And I think that the two elements for that are really the idea of the governance.
Mm-hmm. Keep it
And
low. keep that local decision making as closely can, keep the authority where it belongs.
Right. And to bring everybody into the room when there are major things to be discussed, at least twice a year.
And you can do this now with technologies like you and I. I mean, you're in Vermont, I'm in Connecticut. You can have people from all over that company's touch points in conversation electronically, seeing each other. It's no longer, we can't bring people from Canada all the way down here to Mexico. Sure, Canada can talk to Mexico. So that's a cool thing.
Yeah. And they did a lot of that during COVID.
Oh,
They did a lot of it in terms of many different kinds of meetings. The corporate steering committees were always done in person.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, with COVID, they couldn't. And so they developed ways of doing that to be more interactive, in terms of groups and that sort of thing. But the idea of one of the things that I always felt with Bill, that he had an understanding was of the one and the many.
Yeah.
Of not losing either side of that. And he had a feel for some of the underlying elements of problems. He could really get into seeing how something might unfold to individuals and how important it was that they understood these pieces.
Hmm.
And the company has one of the first group lessons that it did across the corporation, using what in those days was called Zenger Miller. All the supervisors took courses in something called listening.
Yeah.
And the 5 steps to listening.
Yeah. Active listening. Sure.
Yes. And so that was sort of, I thought that was just such an interesting, many people would have started with leadership, as many groups have since, that I've read about.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
How to lead and how to be a leaderful person.
Mm-hmm.
But they wanted their supervisors and their workers to be able to listen to each other. So they started out training the supervisors, and then all the workers took these classes as well.
I just love it. I love it.
I did too.
It is the foundation, isn't it? Listening and seeing it as a practice. Listening is a practice that can be cultivated and grown and developed. I'm looking at my clock, Cecile, and I love this. Wow. I love this story, but I do have at least one primary curiosity. And you and I, it's a speculative one. Bill Karras was cut from a certain cloth. What do you know off the top of your head about his origin that brought him to a point where not only did he have this company at hand, but also had this democratic desire, the belief in the one of the many? Where do you think that came from?
Bill and I are pretty much contemporaries.
Okay.
He was raised in Rutland and I was raised in Bennington, Vermont, 50 miles apart.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we shared part of, I don't want to make this the same, as though I'm saying this is the same. But I think that historically, some of the events of the days were similar. For example, town meeting.
Yep.
The kind of leadership that Vermont had during the days of our being raised. And we were just at the edge of the farm industry changing.
Yeah.
And of course, it was also the time when the hippies came in. It was the time of the war.
Yeah.
It was the time of, a whole lot of unrest. But I think that one of the elements that Bill was very, very respectful of is the democratic idea.
Mm.
He was less comfortable with straight hierarchy.
Yeah.
And bureaucracy for its own sake.
Mm-hmm.
even as he respected management.
Yeah.
But the first thing, for example, in 1980, when he bought the company from his dad, he had been a part of the company for a number of years by that point. He started talking about participatory management, and he spent a lot of time on the floor with workers. And the other thing that probably was a very big element for Bill that might be different than for other entrepreneurs becoming employees, selling to their employees, is that Bill's dad started the company when Bill was in second grade.
Okay.
And Bill spent most afternoons after school in the shop.
The smell of sawdust in his nose.
Pardon me?
Sawdust in his nose and sound of machines in his ears. But as a little guy, that must have been very profound. It's the sound of work. It's the sound of money being made, sound of problems being solved for people who want to wrap cable around something. So that's a great influence.
And I think that, and he loves the people.
Yeah.
He loves those men. In those days, it was primarily men.
Yeah.
That were doing the routing, that were doing, all the work, the assembly. And he recognized how much they cared about his father's company.
Yeah.
In a way that probably he would have never known otherwise.
Yeah. If he had just stepped in as a 30-something outside guy coming in to take over, the family business, having had other experiences, but he was part and parcel of the DNA of that business, wasn't he?
And I think that was part of the practice for him.
Mm-hmm.
Was he always heard their stories.
Yeah.
And so he was always wanting to know, and he had that very inspiring way of looking at them.
Mm.
Because when he was a little person, remember, they were the experts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the roles changed, of course.
Yeah.
But he never discounted what they knew.
Well, that I would like to bottle up and put in glasses all over the business world and say, drink this. It's called respect. Yes. To the extent that you are truly interested in what people know who are doing the job. That's a one-page management textbook. But boy, I'd love to see it come back.
And Pew Research this past, maybe June, they brought out a research piece on the Great Resignation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the elements for why people were leaving their jobs was the fact that they were not respected.
Yes, I've seen that those studies too, and those results. It's troubling.
And I think that one of the dilemmas that we have as a country is that many people think if money is being made, why are they worried about this?
Yeah. Yeah, they still see profits. They still see it. Yeah. Well, I think, you and I need at least another 70 or so years to work on this, Cecile, and I'd love to find a way we were working on it together sometime because you really have a passion and a unique vantage point. I will wrap up with this about your practice. What a wonderful concurrence that you and Bill were contemporaries. You have had the access over a period of time. Now the rare access as an observer and appreciator of organization development. You know what works.
Thank you.
You really do. You got a great story. I hope there's a book in this for you.
I'm working on a proposal even as we speak.
There you go. Please do. And as I said, the first page should be follow Bill Karras's advice and pay attention, damn it.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Cecile.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Oh, and one more thing. How could I forget? The book on practice as a way of being is available now in digital form, something that would be new, like podcasting to many of us. And it's a great way of learning more and more about what this podcast presented when Peter Vale and I originated it several years ago. So please come to mylibrary.world/practice, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you.